When we have been traumatized or are under stress, every part of our gastrointestinal tract, from the very top, from our what's called the cephalic phase of digestion, which refers to the head, what we think and how we relate to food, all the way down through the esophagus and the stomach and the small and large intestine, all the way through the process of assimilation of food and excretion of waste matter that's left over. Every part is affected by stress and trauma. So briefly, if we're anxious and agitated, as we are in fight or flight, our food choices tend to be a bit sketchy, and we tend to eat very fast. And that eating fast, in turn, produces a great deal of gas and disrupts the process that's going on in our stomach, first of all. And it may alter, sometimes reduce, the amount of acid in the stomach that we need for digestion. So that's head down to the stomach. In the small intestine, where the overwhelming majority of assimilation of nutrients take place, the disruption is very significant. In addition to the small intestine not being as efficient, because if you remember in fight or flight, digestion's kind of shut down, what also happens is that the cells that line the small intestine, which ordinarily are very close together, they're called endothelial cells because they're on the interior of the small intestine. When we're in a state of calm and relaxation and life is okay, those cells are close together. They have what's called tight junctions. And food can't pass through between those cells and into the bloodstream. So the only food, the only nutrients that are going into the bloodstream, with some exceptions, are those that are well digested, that are meant to diffuse, to cross from the small intestine into the bloodstream. However, when we've been traumatized, after a war, or the pandemic, or after a loss, or when the stress is chronic, those cells that line the small intestine often separate. And so molecules of food that are not meant to go into the bloodstream go into the bloodstream. And many different kinds of molecules. The best known and perhaps the most damaging to us is gluten, which is a protein and part of wheat and rye and barley and many other grains. Ordinarily, for most of us, unless we have celiac disease, specific condition, gluten doesn't diffuse across the small intestine into the bloodstream. When we've been traumatized or under stress, it's much more likely to. And it goes throughout the bloodstream. And in many instances, it causes an inflammatory response because it's not meant to be there. And so our body responds to protect us. When this happens in the brain, it may create symptoms of anxiety, of depression, and of cognitive disturbance. We may not think so clearly. Second major consequence in the small intestine is a disruption in the microbiome. That's a word that's become very current, very fashionable, and appropriately so recently. Microbiome refers to the trillions, literally trillions of bacteria which live in our digestive system. Primarily in the small intestine, there are the good bacteria. There are the ones that help us to function. There are the ones that communicate, interestingly, through the vagus nerve with our brain. And when we're in a state of psychological and physiological balance, we have an overwhelming majority of those good bacteria in our small intestine. After trauma, under ongoing stress, that can change. And the bad bacteria, the ones that cause disease, grow more abundant. Sometimes they migrate from the large intestine into the small intestine and then multiply there. Sometimes the ones in the small intestine multiply more. Now, why is this important? When the microbiome composition changes, then the signals that the microbiome, those trillions of bacteria, are sending to the rest of our bodies also get damaged. Those signals are not the sort of pure go ahead, here's a instruction about how to work well in the immune system. Here are instructions conveyed to the brain through that vagus nerve that we talked about right at the beginning of our time together that help the brain rebuild itself when it's under stress and when it's traumatized. So the microbiome is disrupted. And the signals that are going to the brain are not providing a clear message or a strong positive message. So we're not getting the regeneration of the brain that is possible. So an intrinsic and critically important part of healing ourselves when we've suffered trauma or when we're going through ongoing stress is through what we eat. Hippocrates famously said 2,500 years ago, Hippocrates, the father, the founder of our Western medicine, said, "Let food be your medicine and medicine your food."